All right, welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. My clock on my computer says it is 6:30 and I want to honor your time. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm Jason Stevenson, the Director of Secondary English Language Arts for the State Department of Education here in Oklahoma. This recording or this session is being recorded. It will be placed on YouTube in about a month or so for people who weren't able to make it. Can everyone see my screen that I'm sharing right now? Great. So this session is called Accelerating Instruction with the Revised ELA Standards, and this is the virtual edition, virtual version of that. I've taken this workshop on the road to Chickasha and Durant and Alva, and later I'll be going to Tulsa and El Reno, but this is the virtual version of that. So we'll go ahead and get started. Like I said, my name is Jason, and you can reach me at this email address here on the screen. And then I work in the office at the State Department 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and that's my office phone number if you'd have, or rather just call me. So before I forget, we're going to do a quick poll to get to know you so that I can learn more about you. So we're going to do this demographics poll. I'm going to launch it. And if you have the right requirements on your computer, you'll be able to answer 2 quick questions of which region of the state are you from and which grade or grades do you teach, just so I get a better sense of the people who are here. And we have over 76 participation in this already. We're doing pretty good. We've got a good group tonight too. Again, thank you all for being here after a long Tuesday. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and I'm also going to share the results with you all so you can kind of see the crowd. Let me see, share results, and hopefully it's showing up on your screen that we've got a pretty varied crop of regions represented, but overwhelmingly tonight, we are here with 7th and 8th grade teachers. We also have some others, but they are the stars of the show tonight. So again, thank you all for being here. Just wanted to kind of get a sense of the crowd. I'm going to stop sharing the poll results and get back to the slide deck. So Zoom skills, you all know how to turn your cameras off and on at this point, hopefully. I do like presenting to faces. So if you are comfortable keeping your camera on for part or all of this presentation, that does help me. I also understand if you'd rather just leave it off because you've had a long day and maybe you're in your comfy clothes, and I totally get that too. You can turn your mics on and off if we've ever got a point in the session where you'd like to share out. And then there's also, depending on your version of Zoom, ways to react. There are like little emoticons that you can use throughout the session if you're comfortable doing that. Also, please feel free to use the chat box. I will try to do my best to monitor it, but there's one of me and a lot of you all. I do have 2 screens, so that is to my advantage. So I'll do my best to check in on that. We will use breakout rooms once or twice tonight, depending on how it goes. I do ask that you participate in your breakout room. I'll make them small so that it's not overwhelming, probably just 4 people. And please take breaks as needed. We are going to do a fast and furious 90 minutes, and there will be there's at least one natural break where you can get up and go. But if at any point you do need to take care of something, because here we are living in this day and age with all the things, and you have an emergency, just turn your camera off, make sure you're muted, and take your break if you need it. So that's my Zoom protocol. You all probably have your own things that you might have told your students in the past. So I had 2 presentations already about the standards. I want you to know that they are both on YouTube. My one in June during Engage OK was about transforming instruction to reflect the revised Oklahoma academic standards. And I'm going to share a link with you to all of these resources at the end of the session. So I'll give you a Google Doc with about 15 hyperlinks to everything I'm going to share with you. So please know I'm trying to do my best to take care of you. Those major shifts in the standards at the secondary level included mechanics, writing modes that were more precise with their expectations, and writing process now includes publishing. The July presentation that's also available online is an introduction to the vertical progression documents for the standards, as well as the appendix, and that one's an hour long as well. So had we had this session in person, what I just told you about would have taken an hour and a half of recapping. But because they're available online and we have an online session tonight, we're just breezing past the first hour and a half of my 3-hour workshop, and you get the meat of the workshop, the final hour and a half. That's how I've got it organized for you all. In case you don't know, there are other there's one more set of implementation documents for the new standards, and that's a crosswalk from the 2016 standards to the 2021. All those links I'm going to share with you. So our learning goal for our workshop tonight is that you as participants will discuss how to braid objectives into lessons for accelerated instruction that supports social emotional learning and English learners. We're going to do all this in 90 minutes. So we're going to get started with this comic strip, and I invite anyone who wants to play along with me to unmute and read one of the parts. If it's a lady who volunteers, you will read the part of the boy. If a man volunteers, I'll let you pick which character you want to be. So anyone want to play along with me and read this comic strip for the group? All you have to do is unmute and say,
I will.
Pick me. Thank you. All right. Will you please read the part of the boy? So I'll start with the grandpa. What you got there, Nelson?
Report card.
So how did you do?
I'm math strong, but I Englished pretty good.
That's okay. I English way better than I math. So in response to this comic strip, we're going to do a bit of a quick write. Hopefully you have pen or paper handy, or you can pull up a Google Doc or something on your computer to do some writing, or you can write on your phone. Or if you are so tired and you would rather compose in your head, I will allow that as well. So pick one of these prompts, please. Are your students pretty good at English? How do you know? Or how does this comic strip play with grammar? Or how will the new standards help your students become better at ELA, if you're familiar with them? So take a few seconds and make your selection for which prompt you'd like to write in response to. And then I'm going to put only 2 minutes on the clock. So you're going to have to write really fast or think really fast if you're composing in your head. Everyone got their prompt picked out, hopefully. I'm going to put 2 minutes on the clock, and I'm going to pause the recording while you do a bit of writing or thinking. All right, away you go. So I don't forget. So if there is a volunteer, would love for you to share with the group. You can turn your mic on, or you can put it in the chat box and I can read it out loud for the benefit of the group. So anyone have a response they'd like to either read or talk about?
I just said I don't think that my students are good at English or grammar because the social media platforms that they are on, they don't require themselves and their friends to grammatically speak to each other correctly or use punctuation or complete sentences. And so I feel like sometimes that falls through when we're essay writing. And so I kind of just start off the year between informal and formal writing, and we talk about how to formally write an email or the different kinds of different writing and who your audiences are. And so that way, when you're thinking about your audience, you're more likely to want to impress them better depending on who you're writing for. And we talked about kind of how punctuation matters in let's eat, comma, grandma versus let's eat grandma.
Right, makes a big difference. So I really like that you are pointing that out to your students, that audience matters, and that's probably going to affect the way that they construct their sentences and even use punctuation. I remember learning a couple of years back that some students believe that a period at the end of the sentence is a sign of aggression or a sign of anger or dominance. And, people their age don't always use punctuation at the ends of sentences. And there's even a meaning to that. So someone was echoing Ryan's sentiment there. Erica. And then one more person maybe you want to share out, either in response to what Ryan shared or maybe in response to one of the other questions?
Hey, I'll agree with Ryan. My students are not good at grammar, but I'm really noticing they don't have the speaking and listening skills. So there's no way for them to translate that into reading and writing. And I do teach special ed, but I find myself backing way up a lot to just speaking correctly and how to listen before we can read and write.
All of those components of English language arts are crucial and interconnected: speaking, listening, reading, writing. All right, we're going to get back to the presentation. So let me share my screen again. Thank you all for sharing out. Really appreciate that. A gold star to the people that did. So just a quick recap of the new standards that we have. The review and revision took place during 2020 with over 60 educators in the state participating in that work. We had teachers who worked on the writing teams as well as the draft review committees. Earlier this year, the State Board of Education formally approved the standards unanimously. They went to the state legislature, and there they were formally approved at the end of May. So they are official with a capital O. They are available here at this website on this standards page, which really I need to put that in the chat for you really quickly. So I'm going to copy and paste right now real quick into the chat box. And this will take you to kind of a hub page of not only the standards, but all of those implementation documents that I mentioned earlier. We will be looking at these standards later on in this session, so it's important that you pull them up. When you get to this website, you can just click on the picture of the standards cover. And I think there's also a hyperlink on the words themselves. So two different ways to get to that document. The implementation documents that I just mentioned are further down on that page, including a crosswalk for secondary, a vertical progression for grades 3 through 8 if you teach grades 6 and 7. And then if you teach grades 8 through 12, I recommend the vertical progression for grades 6 through 12. The glossary's been updated online as well as in the appendix, which you can also download as a separate resource. And then those videos to my presentations I mentioned earlier are those last two little buttons there at the bottom of that page. So people do have questions about assessment, and the school districts this year are determining how they want to roll out the new standards. Are they doing it right now this school year, or do they want to wait? Or do they want to take some time to study them or roll out only some of the new standards this year, but still teach 2016 ELA standards? Because in the spring of 2022, since we're now in October of 2021, the OSTP will still be aligned to the 2016 standards. But next school year, a year from now, districts do need to align to the new 2021 standards. And then that spring of 2023, the OSTP will be aligned to the 2021 standards, just so you kind of know where things are at. Hopefully that clears some things up. I had an email today from someone about that. So now we're shifting gears to talking about accelerating learning. And this is when I'm going to put you in breakout rooms. So you can pick one of these questions or just the topic of how pandemic life has changed teaching and learning for you. But how has the pandemic impacted your students' learning of English language arts? Or how has the recursive nature of English language arts impacted student learning even during a global pandemic? Or again, if you're familiar with the new standards, how can they streamline your students' learning? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen again. I'm going to stop the recording or pause the. All right, welcome back from breakout rooms. Hopefully we'll get a few more people to migrate back to us in just a little bit. We'll wait until we've got a few more people before we resume. And we'll be asking one or two of you to share out with the whole group though. So be thinking about if you'd like to share or if you'd like to volunteer someone else to share. All right, looks like everyone's back from their breakout room. I ended up giving you 4 minutes instead of 3. So hopefully that was enough time for at least a couple of you to share out and maybe respond to one another. Would anyone like to share just one little nugget or one little thing that your group talked about, or maybe volunteer someone in your group? They had something really good to say, maybe.
The women in my group had some great points. They're just talking about how difficult it is, the fact that the reading levels are a lot different, the fact of the participation virtual, hybrid, in person, right? I mean, I had Tammy and Ryan. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Tammy or Ryan? Thank you, Hillary, though, for getting us started and knowing that in the past, students did come to us at all sorts of reading levels, but this pandemic has magnified those differences, is what it sounds like for you, or what your group was talking about.
Well, we had a conversation building wide. As a reading teacher, I had all the other kind of electives come to me and all the core classes come to me. Even my high school math teacher came to me and she goes, "They cannot read out loud. I know you do it in your class and I know you've done it." And I said, "Yeah, they came to me that way and I sent them on." It's not that I just sent them on, but it's just that even as junior high kids, they came off of their pandemic year when it all shut down. And it's like their reading levels are really low and they can't read fluently out loud. Like
So
that is one of the biggest issues I've seen, is they just don't want to read out loud. And then they go to other classes and then everyone notices it as well.
So fluency also an issue, it sounds like, that we'll be working on with our students to build that back up, or to build it up in the first place. But I'm going to share my screen again. Thank you all for sharing that. And your perspective really is so valuable for me to hear as I develop guidance and future workshops for you all. Okay, so here's my screen again, and we're going to get to talking about some of the guidance that's already been shared out through the State Department's page on accelerating learning, which is how can students be supported through accelerated learning in English language arts. This comes from an initiative that the State Department put together in response to the pandemic. And some of the information from this document says that to accelerate learning within the classroom, it's important to use current data from high quality evidence-based screeners, diagnostic assessments, and formative assessments to best determine where students are. You all do this naturally as English teachers. You were just talking about, I can hear when my students are fluent readers or not. I can see it in their writing when they've got a good hold of grammar or not. And then some of you are probably in school districts that have common formative assessments, CFAs, one more bit of education jargon that we educators get to toss around. And those can be helpful as well to determine where students are at. That mentioning of screeners and diagnostics applies more to elementary ELA, especially our students who are still learning how to read. One more bit of advice in this accelerated learning document says that teachers can scaffold instruction up instead of bringing content down to meet current grade level expectations. And we can do this through modeling and through explicit instruction. And then if we've got that intervention time, to provide targeted instruction on specific skills. Elementary teachers have a lot to offer us, secondary teachers, in that skill of using small groups and targeting those different skills. And that may become something that we as secondary teachers do more so in the future, especially during this time of responding to our students who come to us with different skill sets and maybe some gaps. And I'm really looking at you middle school teachers who are here right now, because there might be some upper elementary kiddos who slip through and come to you and they need the extra help and targeted instruction. So another strategy that can be used to help accelerate learning in the classroom is to braid standards together into one lesson. So English language arts naturally lend themselves to this. They cover multiple standards, speaking and listening in a lesson, as well as critical reading, or writing and maybe some vocabulary, instead of teaching only one objective at a time, you'd never get through the standards in one school year. And students need lots of practice with these anyway, repeated practice. So that's all I mean by braiding, is using multiple objectives in one lesson. And you keep recycling and repeating and using that whole nature of recursivity for reading and writing. So I had a sample braided lesson in one of those previous sessions that I talked about, and I'm going to give you a very fast recap of it right now. It uses the new standards. It would be for 9th and 10th grade ELA. These are the objectives that I would cover in this example lesson. The bread and butter of English language arts, analysis of literature and all of those literary devices, but then also a new standard, which is one of the mechanics objectives at the high school level now, that students will use a colon to reveal information. The mechanics objectives in the past, in the 2016 standards, were very broad, and the new standards have very specific skills for the different punctuation marks. So this is an example of that right here. In addition, I would fold in some multimodal literacies in this lesson with an objective from standard 7. And the way I would do that would be through poetry. I love poetry. It's fast, it's quick. You can get through multiple poems in one class period. I used to start my class, my sophomore class, once a week with a poem. My students knew to expect that on Thursdays, they were going to start class with a poem after we did our independent reading, because every class started with 10 minutes of reading. Anyhow, this is a poem called The Two-Headed Calf, based on a real-life scientific phenomenon that two-headed calves are born. They don't live very long, but it's a sweet, sad poem about that. And then a comic artist that I follow on Twitter created a comic version of the same poem. And so during the lesson, I would have my students compare and contrast the text-only poem with the comic version. And I'd also highlight the fact that this poem does make use of a colon to reveal information. And then I would have multiple examples of that in like YA books, some sentences, some mentor texts, mentor sentences, and then have students study those and then write in response their own sentences. And we could probably get all of that done in 50 minutes, maybe a tiny bit more time the next day. And I would be hitting 3 different objectives. And I didn't even cover everything from the lesson, but if you watch my old presentations, you can hear more. But that's kind of the idea here, is that we can use objectives from many different standards, or use a couple objectives from the same standard and hit all of them within just one lesson. So hopefully ahead of time, you received an email from me telling you about these 3 different anchor texts, or it just gave them to you. And I'm going to ask you tonight to use one of these anchor texts as the start to a lesson. And Let X is a short story that is set in the 1980s. And it's a boy in 5th grade who's trying to impress a girl on the playground at recess, and he fails miserably. But it's told through algebraic terminology, like let X equal 3, let Y equal 5, solve this equation, X plus Y equals. So we're English teachers, but we got this. The answer would be 8, right? But in this story, let X is literary, okay? And then if you'd rather work with a poem tonight, The Raincoat by Ada Limon is about a speaker reflecting on the sacrifices her parents made, specifically her mother, to take care of her spinal issues when she was a child. And Ada Limon is now hosting The Slowdown, which is a podcast that shares a new poem by a different poet every weekday, Monday through Friday, with just a short little bit of context and then the poem. Tracy K. Smith hosted it for about 2 years. It went on hiatus and now it's back, and Ada Limon hosted, and it's fantastic. That's bonus. The other workshops did not get that nugget. And then the third anchor text is Finna by Nate Marshall, and the speaker traces their feelings about the slang word finna, which is short for fixing to. And you might know that term already, but that might be new to you, that some people abbreviate or smash the words fixing to together to make the word finna. And specifically that originated in African-American culture, Black culture. So I want to do a poll because I want to know which of these anchor texts you're going to use. I hope some of you had a chance to print them off at school already. I have annotated all 3 of mine, but I need to get them to you right now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to put the link to them in the chat box. This handout also includes the lesson plan template that we will use during this session. Why don't we do this? Because I did not do a poll. Can you say on your reaction with a yes or a no if you were able to print these off already? Like, did you print out the packet or get my email and get it printed off? Yes or no? And I'm going to look at participants and see if it shows. I think you have to go to reactions and then a green checkbox or a red X. Yeah, it looks like most of us weren't able to do that. A few of you were, and that's okay. We're going to make it happen. So hopefully in the chat box now. Oh, and people didn't get my email. Check your junk folder. I know I sent it. So please click the link that's in the chat box, and hopefully that's going to pull up a 5-page PDF, and it's going to have all 3 mentor texts there for you to read. You're going to use this in your sample lesson that you begin developing with me tonight for the rest of the workshop. And I am going to give you time to read one of them. And I'm going to clear your reactions now, if that's okay. But take a moment, read through one of these anchor texts. This might be a good time for a break if you need to do something, if you've already read your anchor text, but we'll be right back in just a little bit. I'm going to pause the recording. And we are back to recording, and we're going to move along to our next poll. You can probably guess what this poll question is going to be about. And it is, which anchor text did you choose? So I'll let you vote and then I'll share the results. It's been interesting to see what the different cities I presented at have picked as their anchor text. And you may not be finished, but I hope most of you are. I bet you can catch up in between. You've just got a little bit more to read. We've got 21 of you have voted. Just need a few more to vote. I want to give you time. All right, I'm going to end the poll at 81%. That's way more than we get in real life elections. So here's the results. Looks like a pretty even split, but more people picking poetry over that piece of fiction. And I've read all 3, like I said. And before we move on, just any general comments about the anchor text that you picked, something that jumped out, something you noticed or wondered or liked or disliked that you'd be willing to share with the whole group? And I'll start and say that in prepping for this workshop, I read aloud Finna to one of my colleagues and got choked up. Probably about 2/3 of the way through. Just reading it aloud was an emotional, moving experience. I felt like it was a very powerful poem, and I was hoping some of you would get to have that same experience with it. So with that, anyone else want to share out about the anchor text you picked? Yeah, Jane, please go ahead. Thanks for using the raise hand feature. You don't have to, but I'm glad that you did. Yay.
So you shared about feeling emotional about your anchor text. I read Let X and I felt emotional as well because I just felt those split-second decisions you can make that you regret later. It was a short story, but really powerful feelings that came from it. Just those decisions that you can make or not make so quickly.
Absolutely. And it has this figurative language, and the repetition or anaphora in it makes it feel almost like a poem. So I feel like it achieved that same emotional punch, just like that Finna poem. I also recommended to a teacher in Alva that one thing to do with that anchor text might be, and this is giving something away, so maybe I'm going to hush and I'll bring it up again later toward the end of this session. toward the end of this workshop. So I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's move on. I am sharing my screen, right? You can see it. So next, we're going to work through thinking about how we could use this anchor text in a lesson with objectives that we have rated in. In the chat box, I shared with you a link to a Google Doc. It's going to make you make a copy. It will force you to make a copy of it, but then you can just type along in it. And this is for those of you who weren't able to print off the handout in advance or didn't get my email for some reason, which I sent it Friday afternoon, I think is when I sent it. But in the chat box, click that link and you'll see the lesson plan template to just type along in during the rest of our session. Hopefully that pulls up for you. And so what I'd like you to think about now, and I'll give you some work time, is using your anchor text, determine which objectives from your grade, or if you teach multiple grades, just pick one, you could braid into a lesson. So questions to consider: will the objectives come from one standard or multiple standards? Will any of the objectives contain content that you have already addressed this year? And it's just kind of a return to it, making sure they maybe can grasp it in the context of a poem versus a short story, or vice versa. Will any of the objectives contain brand new concepts for your students? And then just in general, how do you balance the objectives that you choose? Just because you could find 10 objectives that would all possibly work with this text does not mean you should pick 10. That'd be way too many, right? So you have to find a balance, and you have to kind of get the best bundle of objectives to braid together. So I'm gonna, let's see, stop sharing my screen, and I'm gonna pause. Stop sharing. I know this feels really fast and furious, but I do want to get us back on track. We might have one or two of you share out the anchor text you picked, and just at least one objective you've identified that you might teach in a lesson with this anchor text. So anyone willing to share with the whole group? I will say that if you go into critical reading standard 3 and find one on literary devices or literary elements, that might be one place that you would start with this anchor text. You probably would not cover every single literary element or device from that objective because it's a litany, and that would be a whole lot, but you could probably identify 2 or 3 that you'd want to highlight with that anchor text. Anyone else want to talk about a standard you might incorporate in a lesson with this anchor text?
So I pulled FINA, and I said that I wanted to use 11.3.R2, evaluate author's perspectives and explain how those perspectives contribute to the meaning of the text.
Fabulous. I like that. Any further thoughts there on how that would look in your classroom, maybe?
I've got a really diverse group of students, but we live in a really small town. So all of these kids have known each other since they were 6. But I think that bringing that perspective together would be really interesting in the classroom, seeing them interact with that kind of language together.
Yes.
Because there is still a really big divide in how they speak based on what side of town they live on.
A comment a teacher made when I was down in Durant was, she said something like, I don't have students who are Black, but I have students who are in poverty, and they know what it's like to go through X, Y, or Z. And because of those things, this teacher felt FINA would still work very well in her classroom. All right, anyone else before we move on?
I'll go.
Great, thanks, Sarah.
I did the raincoat, and for my 7th graders, I thought 7.4R3 would be really good for them to use context clues to determine words in here that they don't know.
Can you say a word or two for people who didn't read that anchor text?
Even my voice sounded unfettered.
Right.
I mean,
Unfettered's in there. That's a tough one.
yeah. I was actually just going over this in my class this week, and it was amazing at how much vocabulary they don't know. So putting all this together is great.
Yeah, but you give them the tools, you give them
Yeah.
Greek and Latin roots, teach them context clues, and hopefully they will soar in their vocabulary knowledge. Thank you all for your comments. I also saw in the chat, we had some people talking about multimodal with the raincoat imagery and speaking and listening for discussion. Absolutely with these. All right, so we're going to share screen again and move right along. I appreciate your willingness to share. It can be intimidating sometimes in a Zoom with other English teachers, perhaps judging your grammar. Hopefully not. Hopefully this is a safe space. All right, and I am recording still, so that's great. So the next thing to think about in your lesson plan template, and hopefully you can see these questions in the screen, as well as pull your template up to type in it. But now it's kind of thinking through a 5E model for a lesson. You don't have to plan an English lesson this way. It's one option. I learned it from the K20 Center, where I've written a couple lessons for, based out of OU there in Norman. So the 5 E's are engage, explore, explain, extend, and evaluate. And so I've got some guiding questions for you there, which maybe I could put them in the chat for you too, and that'd be an easier way for you all to grab them as you think through maybe 5 different stages in your lesson with this anchor text, what you could perhaps do with your students. In my example that I shared earlier, I had students working with mentor sentences with colons, and that would have fit into the extend section of the lesson. How will students apply their understanding of an aspect of the text? Because they were then writing their own sentences using colons to reveal information. So again, I'm going to be quiet and I'm going to pause the recording again so you have some thinking time. You may not get to all 5 stages, but hopefully you come up with a few different ideas. I'm also going to share my idea for an extend activity for let X that I almost revealed too early just a bit ago. All right, hopefully you all had some lively conversations and some inspiration from other teachers on ideas for your lesson. The idea that I had for let X, maybe some of you had the same idea for kind of a rounding out of that lesson, would be to have students rewrite the ending that is implied but never stated, about what could that tender moment have been instead, and have students use that same algebraic language in their rewrite. So that was an idea that I had. Okay, so we've got 30 minutes and we're going to conquer social emotional learning and English learners rapid fire. So can you see my screen and are you with me? I hope you are. So social emotional learning, we're going to apply that to our lesson as well. But first, definition and a rationale. So social emotional learning, as most of us know by now, it's been a push in our state for a couple of years now in response to our ACE scores of students in our state. But it's the process through which people acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. So awareness and discussion of social emotional skills help fulfill the need to improve the overall mental and behavioral health of children, families, and communities during this pandemic, and when this pandemic is over, whenever that may be. But that's why it's so important that we engage in this work with social emotional learning. Social emotional learning instruction is safe, and that's an acrostic. So sequenced, active, focused, and explicit. And I want to focus in on the focused part with this lesson. So it's implementing curriculum that intentionally emphasizes the development of SEL competencies. There are 5 that we're going to look at, and I'm going to ask you to only identify one that best fits in your lesson, that pairs the best with your anchor text. The temptation is to say, ooh, all 5 do. They all 5 work. And that's what happened when I was in Chickasha, when I had this question worded differently. But I'm going to ask you to stretch yourself and really pick which of these 5 do you think fits the best. And I'll give you some guiding questions, okay? So the core SEL competencies are self-awareness and self-management, social awareness and relationship skills, and then responsible decision-making, which based on all those stories I've heard about what the TikTok trends are right now and what they are going to be, I think responsible decision-making would be an SEL skill for some of those kids engaging in those TikTok challenges. So we're going to go through all 5 competencies now, and you be thinking about which of these 5 best fits with your anchor text that you could teach with it. Self-awareness is the abilities to understand one's own emotions, thoughts, and values, and how they influence behavior across contexts. So for your anchor text, does the text demonstrate a range of emotions and how to deal with them? And does the text value different ways of experiencing and processing emotions? So that'd be self-awareness. Next, we have self-management, the abilities to manage one's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors effectively in different situations and to achieve goals and aspirations. So, does the text show a range of ways to deal with powerful emotions? Does the text show a complex view of challenges that may not be easily overcome? And does the text represent personal and structural challenges? Social awareness is the abilities to understand the perspectives of and empathize with others, including those from diverse backgrounds, cultures, and contexts. So for your anchor text, how does it represent differences among people, groups, and cultures? How does this text demonstrate ways of understanding others' emotional responses? Relationship skills are the abilities to establish and maintain healthy and supportive relationships and to effectively navigate settings with diverse individuals and groups. So what methods of communication does this text highlight? How does the text represent peer interactions? And does the text depict a complex or simplified view of conflict? And finally, responsible decision-making is abilities to make caring and constructive choices about personal behavior and social interactions across diverse situations. So what types of problems does the text describe? That's not a yes or no question. And then how do people in the text experience struggles? Do they all experience them in the same way with the same results? So all of these reflection questions are in the PDF that I sent you. Unfortunately, I don't have them in that lesson plan template, but I'm going to ask you now to think through all 5 that we just went through fast and furiously, and think about which one of the 5 core competencies could you most effectively target with your anchor text and your graded lesson. So I'm going to let you think about it for a second. You can pull up those questions again by looking on, I think, the final page of that PDF I sent you earlier, same one that has the anchor texts. And when you're ready, I'm going to do the final poll. And I'll let you vote. I'm curious to see which one of the 5 core competencies could you most effectively target with your braided lesson. And we'll talk in a minute about how you might do that. And I also like how Lindsay put in the chat that the raincoat fits with self-awareness. So if you'd like to identify your anchor text along with the competency in the chat box, feel free to do that as well. You can also vote in the chat box or vote in the poll. I agree with Erica that LEDX does lend itself to relationship skills. Not that it's a perfect example of those, but it opens up the door for an opportunity to discuss them and the development of them. I am pushing 40, and it's sometimes still tough for me to talk about my feelings, but I get better with each passing year. Okay, we've got an 88% participation rate. I want to end the poll and share the results with you. Ta-da! No one picked responsible decision making. So apparently none of the anchor texts lend themselves to that, or at least you didn't identify it as the strongest one of the 5. Quite a bit on self-awareness that got the most votes, followed by social awareness, and then the other 2. So I'm going to stop sharing the results. I'm also going to stop sharing my screen briefly so I can hear from maybe 1 or 2 of you. How would you address this core competency in your class? Would it be a discussion? Would it be at the beginning, middle, or end of the lesson? Would it be some sort of activity or some other method? Anyone have an idea? I know it's a lot to think about and I'm putting you on the spot. So you might just have like an inkling of an idea, and that works too. So if anyone's willing to share, I'd love to hear. Jonathan's maybe raising his hand. You willing to share, Jonathan? Go for it. Thank you.
Yeah, I could see like if we're having a class discussion or encouraging group discussion, I could see fitting in these types of questions somewhere in the middle between the character, between the setting, between all that, because if it's like you're studying all the very English questions, then I could see the kids recognize the pattern. It's like, oh, he finished all those. We're about to get into the emotional questions. And like I could just see them clicking off. You know, if you just do it, it's like that deliberate that they're not mixed into all the other things. Like that's, I don't know, that's how I would probably try to do it if we're trying to do this, that it doesn't give off that it's like he's clearly reading from two different goal sheets.
I muted myself, sorry. I was going to say, Jonathan, it would also maybe be important that maybe your whole department or your whole school's on board with this social emotional learning approach that students kind of come to know. This is kind of how things work in this school. So they are not feeling bamboozled completely by, uh-oh, he's sneaking in SEL in the lesson. But I do like that notion though of, fold it into the rest of the lesson so that they're still getting that learning, but it's not highlighted as like the final piece of the lesson or something. Now we've learned our lesson, right?
Yeah, just trying to make it not awkward. And like that's like so many of these stories would be really awkward to teach. But just trying to keep it not awkward.
Since 1982, trying to not make it awkward. Did anyone else have a thought or comment on the SEL competency you would use with your anchor text and how you might do that? I'm going to pick on Lindsay. She said she would introduce it with a bell ringer, quick write, and then maybe bring it back toward the end. Can you tell us a little bit more, Lindsay, what that might look like?
Yes. So basically with the bell ringer quick write, I would ask them a question related somehow to their own experience. Like, have you ever taken care of someone else, or in your life, has there been a time when someone else has taken care of you? And just kind of get them thinking along those lines, and then construct some kind of exit activity that builds between the bridge between the poem, the raincoat, and what they talked about in their bell ringer.
I love that. The raincoat knocked me over the first time I read it, metaphorically, not literally, but I just thought it was such a fantastic poem. And I love the ending, that image of being protected by the raincoat by someone else and not even realizing that someone else had been sacrificing all along for you. That poem, I think, would make a great paired text with another poem, which I sometimes would use whenever I taught To Kill a Mockingbird. And it's a very old famous poem by now by Robert Hayden called, anyone want to say it with me? Those Winter Sundays. So Those Winter Sundays is also a speaker reflecting on the kind actions of a parent, in this case, a father, and how no one ever really thanked him, but just expected him to take care of them, and how love was still there. So another little bonus nugget for you all. Okay, I'm ready to move on unless there are any other thoughts, comments, or questions on social emotional learning or someone else wanting to share out how they might incorporate it in their lesson. All right, so let's move right along here. And we've already done the poll. So now I want to talk about English learners. The resources I'm going to share with you come from the Oklahoma State Department of Education's English Learner Guidebook that will be in that final document I share with you that has all the links to everything, but I want to highlight a few things and make some connections to some of the anchor texts that we've already talked about today. So looking at this chart, you can see that our English learners are growing in our state. According to some of the most recent data that we have, there are 160 different languages spoken in our classrooms. The numbers are on the rise and we're approaching 60,000 English learners in Oklahoma schools. So you might have an English learner in your classroom this year, or you have in the past, or you might soon, depending on where you live in the state. So the top 10 spoken languages besides English in Oklahoma classrooms, number 1 is Spanish, followed by Vietnamese. And number 3 might surprise you, it's Marshallese from the Marshall Islands. I know there's a big population up in the Enid area, not sure about other parts of the state. So you can see all of those languages there in that list. And the demographics may or may not surprise you that overwhelmingly our English learners are Hispanic, followed by Asian Pacific Islanders. So this guidebook has 5 different practices for working with English learners. We have time to talk about 2 of them together in our 18 minutes remaining. Number 1, grade level standards-based content instruction with English-speaking peers, and 2, high-quality curricular resources. So when it comes to standards-based instruction, a lot of these suggestions you're going to see, you might think, well, I do that in my classroom too, or this works really well for my students, and they're not necessarily English learners, it's just good teaching. So I hope you're going to make some of those connections now. So here are some of those suggestions. To create activities and lessons that integrate reading, writing, speaking, and listening. That one's perfect for English teachers. To design student-friendly language objectives for lessons. More on that in a minute. To pre-teach academic vocabulary and language structures that English learners will encounter or be required to use. To use prior knowledge before a lesson and or build background to fill in gaps. More on that in a second. And then to provide models of exemplary work and rubrics with criteria aligned to the standards. So the reason I've got the first highlighted piece right there is because I gave us a little learning target at the start of this Zoom workshop of what I wanted you to be able to do by the end of the lesson. It's helpful for English learners to have written in student-friendly language the lesson objective of the day. And by objective, in this case, we're talking about a learning objective, not the specific academic standard objectives we talked about earlier. And then also the next highlighted piece I've identified because I wanted to share an example with you about a little bit more background knowledge that would probably be helpful if you were teaching LETX. So students reading that short story and hearing that the main character is trying to impress this girl by talking about a computer club in the 1980s, probably have no idea what a computer looked like in the 1980s. So if I were teaching that text to my students, I would for sure want to show them the original Macintosh computer from 1984. And then a further connection would be is if I were teaching 1984 by George Orwell, I would show them Apple's Macintosh computer commercial, which released during the year 1984, and is a riff on a dystopian moment. Maybe some of you have already seen that commercial before. It is a woman in like an orange suit trying to like overthrow a government full of men, if memory serves me. So I love the fact that a lot of students now don't even know what a floppy disk is. And that's how we used to save things. And yet there is that save icon, right, in our word processors that sometimes they have to press. They don't even know what it looks like. So there's an illusion or lesson. So a quick way to build in some prior knowledge or background knowledge for students. So on your lesson plan template, I think I've given you a space to maybe check off or identify, are there any of these strategies that you could use in your braided lesson? So just a minute or two to think through that. Maybe one person could share a thought or comment before we move on to the second strategy. Anyone have a comment or question here? I think it was Sarah who talked about the vocabulary in the raincoat, and I am about to talk about that in this next one. So let's just move right along. Let me check the chat real quick. Oh,
yeah. Hey, Jason, we're not seeing slides.
I'm going to share the slides again. Thank you. Okay. I really appreciate it. I am recording though, so that's good. All right. So did we see all of these right here? Did we see this? Did we see the old computer? Probably wasn't sharing the screen. So that's what the old computer looks like. And then that's what I was just talking about. So now we've seen all the slides that we missed. Thank you all for letting me know. You're the best. All right. One more approach to think about from this guidebook are high quality strategies and resources. I think there are 5 or 6 listed. We have time to talk about 3: total participation techniques, TPT. This is not the teachers pay teachers TPT. This is total participation techniques, UDL, universal design for learning, and then differentiated instruction. So more on total participation techniques. They are methods to ensure that all students are engaged and actively participating at the same time. We did a quick write at the start of this workshop in response to that comic strip. And so you might use quick writes in your classroom as well, maybe at the beginning of a lesson, middle, or even maybe as a conclusion to a lesson. Well, that's kind of tough for students at the end of a lesson. You can also use appointment agendas or appointment clocks. I remember first being introduced to that a number of years ago and saying, find your clock partner, find your 3 o'clock partner, and everyone in the room gets up and finds their person they're going to be comparing notes with, talking with. And then there are some other strategies like chalkboard splash, bounce cards, holdups, and feature walk. And they are all described in this guidebook, which is only about 20 pages long. And this section, the total participation techniques, I think is only 1 or 2 pages long. But all of those different strategies are described more in detail when you have more time to look at it. So sorry we don't have time to get into them super deeply, but I do want to move on to universal design for learning. So this is reducing barriers and optimizing learning and inclusivity in diverse classrooms. UDL is sometimes compared to a ramp, which makes accessibility available for people in a wheelchair, but also people who aren't in wheelchairs can still use that ramp if they would prefer to use it. And so that's kind of the approach here when thinking about universal design for learning. So what that might look like would be to offer student choice and involve students in decision making. I tried to give choice by letting you all pick which of the 3 anchor texts you wanted to think more deeply about in your braided lesson. I didn't force all of you to read Finna as much as I might have wanted to. I wanted to give you a choice. So you can give student choice in what students read, what students write, how students show their learning. To give timely feedback and promote peer evaluation is another strategy for UDL. To give brain breaks, which if we were in person, I would have given you. Here, I guess you can turn your video camera off if you don't want to feel on, and that gives you a brain break, I guess. To provide explicit instruction of key vocabulary, which I'm about to show for the raincoat as an example. and to connect previous learning to new concepts to make that explicit. You may assume that students make that leap, but if you can connect it for them, it makes it that much better. And then to also model think alouds and comprehension strategies. All of these are examples of universal design for learning. So here's some information, one more, sorry, and to provide sentence frames or sentence stems and other scaffolds, maybe for speaking and listening. Whenever students aren't sure how to engage in discourse or dialogue, you could give them some sentence frames, some sentence stems to help them navigate that at first. All right, now to the example for the raincoat. In addition to unfettered, like Sarah astutely noticed as a challenging word for her students, this poem also had the word osteopathy, maudlin, and marble, and not like the Marvel universe. Or maybe so, actually, now that I think about it. But I want to show you a little bit more about the word maudlin if I were teaching this word to my students. I would give them a definition, weakly and effusively sentimental. But that wouldn't be enough because most of my students would not know what the word effusively meant. So then some synonyms might help. And I'd tell them it also means corny or mushy, and that it's the opposite of sentimental, it's unsentimental. Maybe I'd say it's the opposite of Dwight from The Office, right? And then an example sentence would be, after an emotional breakup, the man queued up a maudlin movie and held back tears until the romantic conclusion. But what was most interesting to me and why I picked this word from that list of 4 is that the origin story for maudlin is that it is a modification in English hundreds of years ago of the word Magdalene, which is from the Bible, Mary Magdalene, who was thought at one time to be the unnamed woman who broke the alabaster jar of perfume for Jesus's feet and cried and like washed his feet with her tears and the perfume. And the Bible never explicitly says that was Mary Magdalene, but some people thought it was. And somehow Magdalene got abbreviated or modified into the word maudlin and got turned into meaning someone who cries a lot or is sentimental or mushy. And that's the etymology or origin of maudlin. But even if my students were not as super excited as I was to learn about the etymology, they would probably get it if I would just say it is every Hallmark Christmas movie that you can watch this holiday season. They are typically maudlin. They are sentimental, they're sappy. It is someone from the big city who comes back to their small town and falls into a bucket in their neighbor's yard, and then they are going to fall in love before it's all over with and bake cookies and the Christmas bells ring on the horse-drawn carriage. Okay, so there's an example, somewhat okay example, I hope, of teaching a vocabulary word explicitly to students from the raincoat, which was one of our anchor texts. We have 6 minutes left. We are right on time. Differentiated instruction is the third and final approach to think about here for number 2 of curricular resources, supporting individual student learning in a classroom of students with varied backgrounds and needs. So the content might be differentiated. The process for how students make sense of the content is taught, whether it's a lecture or they're watching something on their self-paced MacBooks, Chromebooks. The product, how students demonstrate what they've learned. Is it an essay? Maybe it's a poem. Maybe it's a podcast. But the product might be differentiated, as well as the environment. So that would maybe include if students are allowed to wear earbuds and listen to music while they work or while they read, or if you've got low lighting or lamps or beanbag chairs or something in your classroom, and so on. So this was fast and furious. I feel like we needed so much more time, but hopefully you're thinking of ways that you could incorporate one or all 3 of these strategies into some component of your graded lesson as our time comes to a close. So I want to talk very quickly in our final 5 minutes about the ELA curriculum framework revision that will be coming soon. we will need you, teachers like you who are willing to give up a Tuesday evening. If you are familiar with the standards and want to help teachers think more deeply and thoughtfully about how to apply them in the classroom, the curriculum framework as it exists now is wonderful. It's fabulous. It's created by teachers for Oklahoma teachers to fully understand the standards so that they can be implemented with fidelity in their classrooms. But all the information is aligned to 2016 standards, and we need to get it all changed over to 2021 over the course of what I believe will be 3 years. And year one, that application will be coming later this fall. And then the work will be from January through May, and it would be done on the evenings or weekends. And you do get paid for your time and your work on this project. So please consider applying. The application should be available in the next month or so. Also, I need you to take this short survey. It will give me feedback, and you can take it while I give my spiel for the last little bit. I'm going to put it in the chat box for you. I'm going to make sure this goes to everyone. Bam. So hopefully this bit.ly link will take you to a survey, and then the PD certificate. It's right here in the chat box as well. It should download a PDF for you and say that you participated in a workshop for 1.5 hours, which is exactly where we will be at in 3 minutes. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm also going to give you now the landing page link. The landing page has links to everything that I've shared with you tonight. So it's all in one little place. So I've just given you 3 links: the link to the survey, the link to your PDF certificate, and I think the landing page might also have the link to the certificate on it as well to maybe streamline some things. And please let me know if you've got any questions, but I am going to go ahead and stop the recording now because I think we've gotten through all the content.